Hey everybody, Anataki here. Uh, in this video I want to talk about education and why it's important, because one of the ultimate aims of being educated is that you can recognize when you're being manipulated, and one of the biggest manipulators to a human is the government. Now, if one goes to the YouTube or anything like that and looks up and views videos of people that survey people on what they know about the general things, you'll find out that the general outlook of these people being interviewed is that they don't seem to know anything. Now, I'm not sure how well that's manifested itself through the whole population, but if one goes and looks at polls that have been taken, you find out that it's a pretty good indicator of the truth. So, with that, I want to go ahead and start. Now, when I went to school, everybody that I knew was pretty much on the same grade level with me. We had no real dunces. We had no real super smart people. So I see in the general population today a unbelievably dangerous trend where people don't seem to know a damn thing, and it's necessary to be educated, not just in the field that you take at college, but in the course you're taking at college, but in other areas, so that you can have a general understanding on what's going on. So with that, I'm going to start with one thing that I've noticed that's been true throughout history. In this book it's Wheelock's Latin, and he has a phrase in it, a sentence culled from the Bible, which is from Ecclesiastes, and that sentence is nihil sub sole novum, which means that nothing under the sun is new. Now, with that in mind, the recent polls show that people are very uneducated in what they know about our government. And so I want to point out that that's not something that's only happening in this day. It has also happened all the way back through, I would say all the way back to the beginning of the country. Maybe the first 40 or 50 years, the people were better educated upon the government because they were new. It was new to them, and they were curious about it. But after a certain amount of time, people, I don't know when it fell out exactly, but they became more and more uninformed about the goings-ons of government and what it's doing to the people. Now, with the internet, government has been exposed, and it's more easily exposed because more people have more access to information, and they can monitor the government, even though not enough people are. Especially, it seems now that the press doesn't care about monitoring the government, unless it's the opposite mindset of the person in power, which means if it's a Democratic president, then the conservative media is doing its job. If it's a Republican president, it seems that the liberal media is doing their job, but they don't focus on the real things. They focus on things that are frivolous or unsubstantiated. So anyway, I said earlier that people were uninformed, and they've been uninformed for a long time. Here, this book is from 1964, and in it they have a section on how uneducated or ill-informed people were back in the 60s. And they say, polls taken not long ago on 5 college campuses in Southern California covering 1,100 students revealed that many of them were hazy about the Bill of Rights. Now, they say that nearly half of the students approved of double jeopardy, which is unconstitutional. About 49% they would support the internment of suspicious persons, which, even though Roosevelt interned the Japanese during World War II, and the Supreme Court backed him up on that internment, today any kind of concentration camps would be extremely suspect under law. They also say that 53% of them would not allow a labor leader to invoke the protection of the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees a right to self-incrimination. So that 53% are mistaken, or were mistaken, I should say. Now, I've read numerous essays on education, one of which was John Milton's treatise or tractate on education. Another is a William James essay on education. I read Emile by Rousseau on education, and he was challenged on that by Wollstonecraft in her thing on the education of, in her book on the education of women. I also read John Locke's on education, and I also read Dewey's book on education, but he was in serious need of an editor, because when you talk about something on a subject like education, you don't need to go on for 400 pages. You only need, unless you're citing statistics from educational surveys, which we did not do, you only need to tell what education is, who needs it, what it should contain, and what the general outcome should be, and the methods of attaining critical thinking, which is one of the primary purposes of education. I also read this book, which is important this compares education in America and in the Soviet Union. This was written in early 60s, and it compared American education and Soviet education, which Soviet education back then was nothing but propaganda to say that communism was the greatest force in mankind, which obviously proved to be false. And then I've read other newspaper articles and things of that nature to I myself be enlightened. Now I'm versed in history and some science and politics. I've read Locke, Tocqueville, and anything else tangential to those people, Hobbes, Filmer, and some other things like Aeschines' letter to Neocles, which is basically education on how a person should run the state, and of course Plato and all of Aristotle, or all available Aristotle. He wrote numerous treatises that no longer exist, and of course all the histories that I can come across, ancient and modern, Thucydides, Polybius, Arian, who else out there? The philosophy of Cicero, and like I said, Aristotle and Plato, and Aurelius, and Epictetus, and Plotinus, and other things along that line. So it's not like I can be tricked by the government. It's very difficult to trick me, and since I can't be tricked, I don't want anybody else to be tricked. Now the young people, or a good portion of the young people anyway, are not learning what they should learn, and that's going to be dangerous for them when they become adults, but more so in the future, because if they're not educated now, they may not be able to discern whether the government's doing right by them or doing wrong by them. And if it's doing wrong by them, like in Venezuela or in North Korea or the old Soviet Union, then they're going to suffer for it. So it's important to have a broad spectrum of education, not just in your one tiny field like art or physics or economics or history, whatever. You need to have a spectrum in order to not be duped, because if you're unfamiliar with another field, let's say you're versed in physics but you're unfamiliar with history, then while you may not be able to be or you may be tricked into voting for somebody who is going to actually harm you in the future. So that's one of the best, or one of the most important reasons why that should be done. Politicians have to, especially liberal politicians, have to trick you into voting for them, because when they're questioned upon what they stand for, they usually dissemble, and that's the worst kind of politician you can get. And if they get into power, they abuse their position, as anybody who's followed politics notices more and more as time goes by. And the general trend in politics is towards the worse, because every society has gone through one revolution or another. Almost every nation that ever was had some kind of civil war. We had our civil war. If you ask a lot of people nowadays when that was, they don't even know. And you can also see England had a civil war in the 1660s. They also had what could be deemed a civil war when the Magna Carta was formed. You also have the Spanish Civil War. You also have the French Civil War, which unseated the King of France and brought in the I guess the first French Republic. Even the American Revolution was a civil war. You also have the ancient civil wars. You have the social war in ancient Rome, which was in the 80 BC. You also have the civil war in after Julius Caesar was killed, when Augustus was fighting against Marcus Antonius. So it's very important for people to have a good understanding upon what's going on in the government, in history, in other countries, in trending things, in order to have an understanding of how to react when something is averse to them. So it's always important to be educated. That only comes through education, and just one field education is as poisonous to a person as a one product producing city or state, like the Detroit auto manufacturing was to Michigan. If you look there now, they've suffered huge shutdowns of factories and all that stuff because they were a one product economy, and that's always dangerous. It's like if Iowa, since Iowa produces the most corn, if they had a blight like the Irish had in the 1840s of the potato crop that affected their potatoes, if Iowa had a blight on their corn crop and it lasted like 5 years, their economy would collapse upon itself. So the same analogy can be seen across certain or almost every field if you look into it. So that's why it's important for people to be educated. Therefore, I think I've covered everything I need to cover in this video, so I'll stop right there. Anataki out.